So I would say, and this is universal to Ahsoka's style, having one blade up and one blade down, it's not really optimal, but I guess you could say it looks cool and it makes for something that's a little bit different and particular to her character. It's just not hugely practical. Hi there, I'm Matt Easton of Schola Gladiatoria, and I teach people how to sword fight. And today I'm going to be critiquing some of the fight scenes in Star Wars: The Clone Wars, the animated series. So just before we get into the fighting, I should say I've always loved the fact that Count Dooku's lightsaber has that sort of canted, as we call it, or forwards curved hilt. It makes it quite similar to certain antique saber hilts, like the ones over my shoulder over here from the 19th century. And one of the main things that I teach is military saber fencing. So I'm a big fan of Dooku's lightsaber. Jedi. So one of the things to mention is something that's absolutely classic Star Wars sword fighting, or lightsaber fighting, if we call it that, is that they bind the blades. So when they stop against each other, they kind of stop. And then classically, in the way that it's choreographed typically in Star Wars fights, they then pull apart. This is not something that is hugely typical of real binds. A bind is when the two blades are touching, primarily because those two blades can slide up and down against each other. And any blade has what we call a strong, a medium, and a weak. The further you get away from the hand, the more leverage is used against your hand, and therefore the weaker you become. So if you've got strong against strong, you have a very strong bind. If the opponent has their strong against your weak, they have the strength of the bind and they can push through and thrust you or cut you or do whatever. And finally, there's the use of the left hand, other parts of the body like knees or kicking, even headbutting, coming at it as a historical swords person, someone studying the actual systems that were used historically to fight with swords. When we look at Star Wars fights, this is one of the things that doesn't quite ring true for us, because they often stick their blades together and then spring apart and start fighting again. And this is not something that's hugely typical of real sword fighting. So he's fighting multiple opponents here, and this is a very particular fighting scenario because, of course, you want to try and get your back to a wall, get into a corridor, get into a corner, somewhere where you can prevent the opponents from surrounding you. And he does exactly that, which is really, really cool. Another minor detail is that fighting against multiple opponents, you don't want to thrust very much because thrusts are linear and they only occupy one person. With cuts, because they travel through space and travel around, you can occupy more people. So a general piece of advice, whether we're looking at Indian martial arts, or whether we're looking at European martial arts or Japanese or Chinese martial arts, is that against multiple opponents, you want to keep moving. You want to try and get your back to a wall or into a corridor or corner. And additionally, you want to keep cutting circularly. You don't want to be too linear in your approach. And that's represented quite well here. Because, you know, if you can do lightning out of your hands, then why wouldn't you in a sword fight? Absolutely. And funnily enough, there is a sort of historical comparison for this, that in the 19th century and 18th century as well, you would often use a sword in one hand and have a pistol in the other. And people often go, oh, you know, why would you use a sword when you've got a gun? Why not use both? And in the age when guns were slow to reload, or even if it's a revolver, then you've only got 5 or 6 shots and you don't have time to reload in combat, then having a gun in one hand and a sword in the other, very good idea. And exactly, it's good that that's represented in Star Wars. If you've got the ability to shoot stuff with one hand, or in this case both hands, but if you've got the ability to shoot stuff with one hand, you would very often use a lightsaber in one hand and shoot your magic lightning bolts with the other hand. Okay, right from the offset here, we've got a very particular fighting situation whereby 2 people are against 2 people. Often in reality, if you fight in this kind of scenario in an open space, it can end up with essentially 2 duels happening separately. And so they've decided to fight back to back, which is a pretty good idea if you're fighting with another person. Opponents can't get behind you. So that's great. The other thing to note as well is that at least one of the people here is using a double-ended lightsaber. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about double-ended lightsabers and do they make make any sense at all. Essentially, they're like a quarterstaff, but historically, and whether we look at China or Japan or Europe, medieval Europe, quarterstaffs were usually actually held at one end. So contrary to what you've seen in old Robin Hood films, or indeed whether it's Darth Maul with a double-ended lightsaber, they're not usually held in the middle. There are some exceptions, but usually quarterstaffs are held at one end, and therefore you have a lot of reach with the other end, like a spear or a halberd, and you use that reach. That's the advantageous thing with a pole weapon, with a staff weapon. So holding it in the middle means you never really have more reach than you would do with a normal sword or a normal lightsaber. So it's a problematic weapon. That being said, I don't think it's totally useless. It does still mean that you only have to carry one weapon and it's still got two blades on it. And it is quite a particular thing to fight against, quite awkward to fight against. But bear in mind that the person using it also takes up more space as well. They can't, for example, hold their weapon perfectly in front of themselves like you could do with the sword and keep the point in front to keep the opponent at bay, because it's got a back blade sticking out the back end. So you have to hold it to one side of your body the whole time. So it's got different considerations that you have to bear in mind when using a weapon like this. I really like the use of Obi-Wan's kicks. It's quite characteristic to him, and 100% we do see kicks used in historical swordsmanship, particularly in European treatises, one of the ones I teach from, in fact. However, the kicks are usually used when the two blades are bound against each other, because that means that the opponent's weapon is occupied at the moment that the kick is made. If you try and make a kick when the opponent's weapon is free and moving around in the air, there is a very large chance you're going to get your leg chopped off. So kicking someone whose weapon is free and unoccupied, really bad idea. I like that it's in there, but I'd like to see the kicks used at the moment when the blades are crossed and occupied. We see Maul there do some kind of very wushu, kind of spinning, twirly kicks, which look awesome. I'm not going to deny that. But we come back to this problem of kicking someone when their weapon, particularly in this case a lightsaber, which only needs to touch you to do you damage, is really, really risky when their weapon isn't occupied. Obi-Wan, with no training there whatsoever, could have just closed his eyes and gone wiggle, wiggle, wiggle with his lightsaber, and that would have been legs all over the place. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of these big, like, dramatic kicks when a weapon's involved, unless the weapon has been occupied somehow first. So this is a really bad way of using two lightsabers. The only possible explanation for why you would use both lightsabers for blocking and then just stay there like this is if the opponent was significantly stronger than you and you needed the strength of both your arms. In that situation, you wouldn't usually block with the two blades parallel. You would possibly cross the two things over. So you form an X with the two blades. This produces a much stronger bind and much stronger control over the opponent's blade. And of course, they don't know whether you're then going to keep one there and disengage with that one, or keep the other one there and disengage with that one. So it gives you options. The problem with binding with both of them is that you're occupying two things to do one job. And theoretically, if you were the same strength as the opponent and able to just parry with one, then in theory you could block with one and run them through the body with the other one. If you were willing to do that. I mean, if you didn't want to kill them, you could maim them or disable them instead. Using both of them to block in many situations is not the best idea. It'd be better to block and attack in the same time with both things. So I'll just talk briefly about the use of two swords together. In this case, it's lightsabers, but two swords used together. There has been a trend in the last decade or so for people criticizing dual wielding. But I have to say, it's absolutely something we find in traditional swordsmanship. But it's not hugely common for a reason I'll explain in a second. Now, where do we find it? We find it in Japanese swordsmanship, sometimes two long swords used together, but most usually a katana and a wakizashi. Miyamoto Musashi was the most famous exponent of this style. In addition to that, there was also dual wielding double sword use found in China. It used with either two dao or two jian. Equally, it was found in the Philippines, and it was found in Europe as well. And some people have said that dual wielding wasn't done in Europe. It absolutely was. It was done by various Italian masters, and we find it most famously in certain Bolognese, that is from Bologna, treatises, two one-handed swords used together. Now, why wasn't it very common? Well, first of all, because on the battlefield, it's more useful if you want to have your left hand carrying something to use a shield, because quite frankly, on the battlefield, biggest immediate danger is things being shot at you or thrown at you. So if there's spears and arrows flying around, a shield is very much more useful than a second sword. By and large, you could put that under the umbrella of saying it's not very easy to learn. So most people that try to fight with two swords, it's not like you're doubling your sword skill. You've still got one brain, you've still got one body, but now you're trying to split your attention between using two swords at the same time. It's not particularly easy. That being said, it does have some advantages. Using a sword in each hand, you could say it's better against multiple opponents because you can keep more space occupied at any one time. And additionally, it's very effective against people who've never faced it before. So against more novice fencers, using two swords can be very, very effective. It can really throw them off their game. So it does have some benefits. It's harder to learn. On the battlefield, not so useful as carrying a sword and a shield because the shield performs so many more useful functions. So really, we tend to see it more in a dueling or one-on-one fighting context, which is exactly what we're seeing here. So I've got no problems with this at all. And in fact, I love seeing double sword stuff, and it's very impressive when it's done well. So now we've got two dual wielders and we've got 4 double-ended lightsabers. That's a lot of lightsaber blades in one room. I've got to say, generally, the choreography here is pretty good. They're getting the idea of the fact that the two weapons can perform different tasks. They can both defend. One can defend and the other can attack. You can mix those up, so you don't always defend with one or always attack with one. And it's pretty well choreographed. There is a lack of thrusting, although I have to say that dual sword styles tend to be more cut-centric than thrust-centric. But nevertheless, it's nicely choreographed. So straight off the bat, I'll say that I believe this was done with motion capture, and you can tell the difference in this particular fight. Funnily enough, not so much in the blades, but the first thing I notice is the footwork. So footwork is hugely important to all martial arts, at least martial arts where you're standing on your feet. I can't express how important it is to fencing. Footwork is absolutely fundamental, and you can only do what you need to do if you're in the right place to do it. What we see with the footwork here, particularly Ray Park as Darth Maul, is the subtlety of movement in those legs and those feet, which is pure wushu kung fu, I believe. The details of the movement of those feet are not something that you would animate out of thin air. They are taken from that actor's particular and very characteristic movement style that we see in the prequel trilogy, with Ray Park actually doing it. So look again at the little shuffles and little movements of the legs and feet there. They are so detailed and so particular to him. The way he strikes with a jumping step each time is very, very interesting. The primary purpose of it, two, in fact, purposes of it, are number one, to cover distance. So it achieves a similar goal to a lunge step. It means that as you strike, you're moving closer to the opponent. So even if they're backpedaling and trying to get away, you're gathering distance on them as you strike. The other thing it does is much like a Superman punch, it adds power, okay? Because it means that at the moment of impact, you're landing. So you're picking yourself up and you're stomping down as you land that blow, which adds a lot of force to the blow. I absolutely love Ahsoka's kick there. Again, is it risky? Yes, if that blade had come up, then that would have been her leg flying off, but it looks fantastic. So one thing we have to mention about Ahsoka is she's quite famous for obviously using two lightsabers at the same time, but she's also quite famous for sometimes holding one or both of them backwards. Now, that's not something we really see in traditional martial arts systems. It's not a very effective way to use a blade. It means that whilst you can use the backwards held blade for parrying or defending with, it becomes really quite rubbish at striking. Not to say it was never done. So I would say, and this is universal to Ahsoka's style, having one blade held blade up and one blade down, it's not really optimal, but I guess you could say it looks cool and makes for something that's a little bit different and particular to her character. So I can understand it from a narrative point of view. It's just not hugely practical. A minor detail, but you often notice that when Ahsoka's running around, she holds her lightsabers reversed, so sticking downwards. But then when she attacks, they are sticking blades upwards. And this is for the reason that I explained, that really to attack effectively and get decent reach and range and power into a blow when you're holding a long sword blade downwards is, I won't say impossible, but certainly not easy. So when they come to show her attacking, surprise, surprise, the blades are upwards because that's what makes sense. She grabbed the middle. This is exactly what I said someone should do. That middle, that is the big weakness of these double-ended lightsabers, apart from the fact that both ends are connected to each other, so you're quite limited in attacking and defending options. But that middle part is clearly a weak point, and not only can you attack it with your lightsaber, but you can grab it. You can grab it and grapple it. It's a great big handle that you can grab onto. And when we're looking at any martial arts that use long hilted or long shafted weapons, whether it's spears, poleaxes, halberds, a rifle or musket with a bayonet attached, then grabbing and controlling the opponent's shaft, so to speak, is hugely important because they've got a great long handle, which means there's a great long handle that potentially you can grab as well. So lovely. I love the fact that they showed that. So I've only ever actually watched the first couple of seasons of the Clone Wars, and it's always been on my to-do list to go and watch the rest. But I've got to say, based on looking at these fights, it looks to me like it got better and better as it went along. And this is what I've heard people say, both in terms of the animation and the way that people move, even the choreography, the complexity of what's going on. I need to go and watch it all. But watching these fights has 100% made me commit to wanting to watch the rest of the Clone Wars.
For more expert reacts, why not check out Matt Easton reacting to the Star Wars trilogies or an accent coach reacting to Oscar Isaac's British accent in Moon Knight.